Hi everyone, welcome to Wheel of Mind, the Wheel of Time point of view reread podcast. This season, we've been reading Matt Cawthon's perspective. Welcome to Season 2, Episode 26, our first Matt episode in Crossroads of Twilight, or Standing in the Snow Looking at Armies, the fan favorite. I'm your co-host, Lajar Dane of the White Aja.
Hi, and I'm Giskel Cimaris, a scholar from Ilion. Today's show is brought to you by Never Crease Laundry Detergent. Ladies, you will never have to waste time smoothing your skirts again. And since we've given a shout out to our sponsor, I also want to remind all of our new listeners that we are a reread podcast and we will drop spoilers at any time without any further warning.
Today we are covering chapters 1 and 2 of Crossroads of Twilight, and I will get us started with my summary of chapter 1, Time to Be Gone. 6 days after our previous chapter in our last episode and the midnight escape from Abu Dar, Matt is sitting on a rock staring out over the river about a mile north of the city. Noel is fishing for minnows, and he tries to engage Matt in conversation about the cold weather that Matt brushes off. He catches sight of oarsmen pulling a body out of the river, so he's not in the mood for chit-chat. That was happening constantly nowadays, and Matt was responsible. He wanted nothing more than not to be. To be in a warm inn far from Abu Dar, winning at dice with some good ale and a pretty woman on his lap. But here he was. Alive, gloriously alive today, which doesn't feel like it, but must be lucky under the circumstances. He's counting, but he keeps losing his place. Counting the ships he can still see afloat in the harbor, as well as the wrecks he can see. Some of the sea folk did indeed escape Abu Dar because of him freeing that windfinder, but many were killed in the fighting or executed following recapture. Many people of other ethnicities, such as native Altarans or the various merchants in the harbor, died as well. Graveyards are full of weeping families this week. He's counting to figure out whether his actions were worth it. Did more escape than die? Did he just cause more death, suffering, and destruction than the Shan-Chen themselves did? He can't be sure, and it keeps eating at him. Some old memories of fitting men into ships resurface, and from that and his counts, he concludes that the Shan-Chen don't have enough ships to get back home. They would not be rooted out. Noel finds that surprising, as even in all his travels, he's never seen so many ships in one place. Matt's thoughts are interrupted even further when Egyanan breaks in to say they are home. They're not going back home. She has disguised herself by cutting her fingernails short, shaving her head, wearing a wig, and going by the Terabonner name Lilwen. Matt asks her about the fate of the recaptured seafolk windfinders, and she assures him they, as the property of the Empress, haven't been mutilated, despite whatever rumors he might have heard. At worst, they were switched, and they're already recovering. In order to bolster their cover story about being adulterous lovers, Matt insists that they walk back to the wagons, which are at the Circuit of Heaven around 2 miles north of town, with their arms around each other, to which Lilwen reluctantly agrees. As they leave the river, Matt sees 2 ships ominously approaching against the wind. A good time to be gone. As he sees scenes of the city in the distance, he flashes back to the escape 6 nights ago. After they left the palace heading for the gate that night, the storm got worse. When they got to the tunnel in the city wall that held the guardhouse, they were faced with soldiers that outnumbered them, and even more concerning, a Suldam and Damani. However, the latter were looking for Marath Damani, not collared women, so the party passed into the guardhouse without any problem. The bundle in front of his saddle containing Tuon occasioned no comment either, and neither she nor Selucia raised any alarm. The guards did not find anything suspicious about Egyanan or Doman as they recorded details about the Damani. But Matt was waiting for the other shoe to drop, positive that something else would go wrong. The alarm bells sounded far to the south, indicating the storehouse fire had been discovered. But then, alarms all throughout the city started sounding. Not only that, but flickers of light, explosions, and screaming filled the air. The windfinders had moved earlier than Matt had planned, but he was soon distracted from that by the dice stopping their tumbling in his head. During the confusion, the guards and Suldam rushed to defend the city, and Matt's party slipped out into the night beyond the walls. Later, he described the destruction thus, quote, lightning bolts lacing through the rain as numerous as blades of grass, and balls of fire streaking across the sky, some the size of horses. And the harbor seemed aflame from one side to the other, till even in a storm the night made any illuminator's show look stark. End quote. He snapped back to the present moment. At least the worst was over, wasn't it? The dice weren't tumbling in his head anymore, so that's probably a good sign. Egyanen was already wanted for something, but now it turns out she'll be super duper wanted for freeing Damane. But there shouldn't be any evidence linking her, Matt, and Tuon's disappearances all together other than the timing. His well-known position as Tylan's toy would provide a good cover for his disappearance and take attention away from the others. Speaking of manhunts and such, there didn't seem to be any alarm or search raised for Tuon, although Egyanen insists that it will be in utter secrecy. Most Shan-Chen can't even know about that. It would cause far too much shame for the Empire for a member of the royal family to be missing. On their walk back to the wagons, they see the ship's archers, which raise Egyanen's hackles. Matt does his best to calm her, and they both hurry back to Luca's show. And thus ends Chapter 1, Time to Be Gone.
Oh, man, that is an awesome episode. It is almost as if it starts out with the slow-moving, sitting, watching them pull bodies out of the river, and you think it's going to be a chapter that has no action, just some of Matt's brooding and planning, and it's almost as if in many of the parts of the books that are in the midst of the slog, which we are definitely in the center of it here in Crossroads of Twilight, as if Robert Jordan is just setting up chess pieces on the board. He's setting up things so all the action can happen later in the last few books. And so there's not as much here. And I begin to get the feeling that that's what this chapter was going to be. And then you get the flashback of the night of the escape. And that's when all the action happens. And that's when everything starts rolling. And even though you're looking at it, looking back into the past and through Matt's eyes and his memories, you get the sense of living through it.
Yeah.
Out of all of these things that happen, it's not surprising to me that Beslin's people come through with the warehouse fires that you expect. It's not really surprising to me that the Windfinders moved a little bit early.
Yeah.
Or perhaps they didn't. Maybe Matt's sense of time was just off because of all the excitement and being so nervous about everything that was happening and all the ways the plan could go wrong. So I'm not certain the Windfinders did move early, but earlier than he wanted them to.
Yeah, because it sounds like they keep time very well. That's something he knew about them,
yes.
and he trusted that they could. I don't know that we have any evidence that Matt is great at telling time like that. I don't know. He might be from, the sun and stuff like that, and a lot of experience on battlefields. I don't really know, but he doesn't really speak to that in his thoughts. So I think you're right. He could be kind of an unreliable narrator here in such a tense moment anyway.
Right. So those things to me were, once we got into the flashback, expected things. That's the kind of things you expect to go wrong, to build tension, to have the story move forward in such a way that there's excitement. And even though you're looking back at something in the past, he survives it. You've got to know how he survived it. You got to know that he made it through this or how he made it through this. How did his luck play into it? But I say the greatest surprise of that entire scene, that entire chapter to me, is that they rolled Tuon up in a rug and she accepted that.
Yeah. Oh.
She accepted that treatment. Out of all the things they could have done, that would have to be the worst, the most humiliating. And I wonder how she pays him back for that. Because do not think that she will ever forget that one. Yeah.
No, that's a great point. The tension of when you realize she's in the rug, or I think it may even be a tapestry or something, but I always think of it as a rug. When he's describing it, he's got his hands on the bundle and he can feel her breathing underneath it, and you can imagine just thinking, oh, that's got to be super obvious. Surely people can see that. And he's got the knife laying flat on it, kind of under his hand, just in case any of the guards makes a move, and he's hoping they can't see that. And there's so much of that tension that I didn't really capture in my summary because it was a long chapter. There was a lot to summarize in it, and there were a lot of kind of scene changes within it. I summarized it sort of like, well, they ended up getting past everybody okay, and then stuff blew up. But like you said, you really feel like you're there, and that's part of what I love about this chapter. I love the structure. So we start with a slow, reflective Matt, which is always a place he doesn't really like to be, as we've been over. It reminds me a lot of some of my other favorite chapters that we've covered this season. So there was I believe it's episode 15 where we covered Lord of Chaos chapter 5, where we had the dancing scene with Betsy and he found Oliver and he's got the dancing flashback and everything.
Right.
The reason those are parallel to me, there are some differences, but for two main reasons. So we're catching up with Matt for the first time in a new book in both of those, Lord of Chaos and Crossroads of Twilight. And in two, both of these chapters have a flashback of some kind in the middle. So in Lord of Chaos, it's the dancing one. Here, it's the escape one. And then actually, there's a third similarity. Matt does a lot of thinking about responsibility. So in Lord of Chaos, we went over so much about how he was starting to take over so much responsibility over the band. He took on Oliver under his wing. Right. He's also thinking and kind of accepting somewhat his part in the pattern in the last battle. And here, he's thinking about responsibility as well. It's just very, very heavy on his shoulders. It's not just, oh, I've got to do inspections for the band and do my job instead of dance. Now it's, wow, I might have been responsible for the deaths of hundreds, thousands, who knows? I can't even count how many people. And are they worse off, the ones who actually survived, than they were before? So it's just interesting that we got these parallels when we we're first catching up with Matt in a book. Now it's just kind of like a leveled up, darker version of that Lord of Chaos chapter.
Yes. Wow, I had not paralleled those two chapters, but once you have, I see that very clearly. And he does. He's very introspective in this one and brooding, which is not normal Matt, you know. As well, it's as though he feels the weight of all these deaths. Yep. And I understand what he's doing when he's looking at the ships, trying to count the wrecks, trying to imagine how many escaped and how many did not. And what he's doing is he's trying to weigh in his mind, like a balance scale, the good I did over here and the damage I did over here, the lives that were lost here and the lives that were saved here, hoping the balance tipped toward lives saved, toward good things done. Now, not to get theological in any way, but a lot of people have that view of their actions in life, and they're trying to have the good things they do outweigh the bad things they do, and we ignore pretty much the indifferent things. What I would not have thought of until our last episode, when you began talking about agency, Matt was not really responsible for those deaths. What he was responsible for was giving people the freedom to make their own choices. Yeah. And that's exactly what happened. He did not do anything that I would say caused the deaths of so many of the sea folk who did die. But what he did is he gave them the chance to make their own choice because they were without choices. Right. Those who were enslaved cleaning out the canals, they had no choices. Those who were collared as damane had no choices. And their people were being treated very harshly. Yeah, what he did is he allowed them the freedom to make their own decisions, to live or die by their own decisions. Yeah. And though he feels the weight of that responsibility, I don't believe he's directly responsible for that. Yeah. I think what he did is allow people to make a choice, which that kind of freedom is precious. That's the kind of freedom a lot of people don't understand. They don't realize how precious it is. It is almost as if we think it would be utopia to have decisions made for us. And once we're there, we find out, no, this is the things about childhood that suck so badly that I wanted to get away from, wanted to grow out of. I wanted to be able to make my own decisions and do my own things. And this is the opposite of that. As well, I feel like Matt really worried about the Xianchen reprisals. He had heard that some damane who tried to escape and things might have a hand cut off or both hands, and that weighed on him so terribly. And as well, I think the reprisals against the people of Ibu Dar, no matter their nationality, whether they were enslaved or free, just he did not want reprisals against them. And that's one thing about the Xianchen that you don't see them doing very often, is bringing reprisals against the common people. What they do is they try to bring justice. They try to find the people who started the rebellion, and they will be very brutal with them. But they don't do what a lot of conquerors do or dictators do. They don't punish everybody for the mistakes or the actions of a few. Right. And as much as I hate how the Xianchen culture is built on this class system that you can't escape from, and the slavery of different sorts and different names, But I do admire that they try to, they don't try that kind of heavy-handedness. Well, let's just teach the entire nation a lesson. No, they try to teach a lesson or stop those and punish those who broke the law, but they leave everyone else alone.
Yeah, it really
less.
is just, it's still not necessarily a good thing, but I think it just makes their empire more effective in governing. That's how they can recruit people culturally into the empire, like we've talked about in some previous episodes about colonization and how that tends to work. So they can recruit people into the Shan-Chen identity once they, supposedly civilize them and bring them these benefits of their civilization. So of course it would be in their best interest not to alienate the majority of the common people and to do what they could to demonize the few who supposedly ruined it for everyone else. We certainly see examples of collective punishment where a leader might take it out on everyone in a nation or of an ethnic group or something like that. And that just ends up not being sustainable. Not only is it morally reprehensible and odious, it's kind of just bad governing policy because you're going to get enough people mad at you that they're eventually going to topple you. You're going to alienate anybody who could have been an ally. And so the Shan-Chen are smarter than that in their subjugation. Yes. And we can see that it works very well. And Matt realizes, I'm not going to be able to root them out. It's so much like that realization. He's realizing, oh, they're setting up shop here. They're coming to stay. There's no putting the genie back in the bottle here. And I think he's seeing that even more. He did his best shot, and he's thinking, like you said before, about all the destruction that he was indirectly responsible for. And I agree with you that he's not as responsible for all of the death and suffering as he feels that he is. And I think that just is part of what's making him a good person, is that he's contemplating that. We're not used to Matt being quite that contemplative about the past. He doesn't like to dwell on things, but this is an important calculation to him. I agree with you that he gave people the choice, and I actually really enjoyed the way the Windfinder responded to him. It sounds like we didn't get to see any of this from their perspective, but it sounds like they had a very strong kind of last stand for many of them. And it seems like something they would have been eager to have the choice to do is to get back to the sea or die trying. I totally agree with your assessment there about his kind of the moral implications of his actions. I think it was good that he gave them the agency. Like you noted, there's probably not going to be a lot of blowback on the majority of Ebudari people. But it's a different turn for Matt to be brooding on this so much when before, it seemed like a huge deal that he was having to worry about how to pay and feed an army, and he's got this kid to worry about now and figure out which of his uncles is such a bad influence. And now he's thinking, wow, I've been responsible for mass deaths. It's such a dark turn for one of our main characters. And this is a point in the series where all of our major Emmons Fielders have had some really dark moments, whether it's them having done morally reprehensible or gray things or having been through very difficult things. Everybody's at a pretty dark place now. We can really feel that evil everywhere in the world. We can feel things kind of starting to unravel as we're getting very close to the last battle. Right.
And as is human nature, so many people, when they're fighting evil, and they're pure evil, they're not just fighting a group of people who are referred to as evil, to cause you to have the ability to go fight them, which is very common in a lot of wars and things we have. But literally fighting against the presence of evil itself, incarnate. So many people get the idea that anything you do is fair game. You can't do something too bad or too evil yourself in fighting against evil. And we find out through the series that's really not how it works. That's one of the reasons Rand did not try to destroy the Dark One, because just in the same way that the Xian-Chen had came and could not be rooted out at this point, they were there, and there was enough of them there with no way home that they were not going to return back across the sea. That you might stop them from spreading, but they're there. But the same way, the Dark One's presence, the evil he had brought into the world, was there, and even destroying him would not have gotten rid of evil. Evil was kind of there to stay, in a very similar parallel there. So many of them, including Matt at this point, are in a dark place because they've done things trying to fight evil that in retrospect, many of them wish they hadn't have done, or it didn't have the same outcome that they expected it to have.
Yeah.
But we're reminded of the fact that none of these characters are superheroes. They may have Taveran powers. They may have the one power. They may have, a lot of tools at their disposal. Yet they're still human beings. They still make mistakes. They still find themselves sometimes in a dark place because of the decisions they made. Very much like any person we all have times in our life that we reflect back on and we say, man, that was really stupid. That was really bad. If I could go back in time, I would change that. I would make a different decision and do a different thing. And I think that's kind of what Matt is doing here, and he's processing it. And as you said before, he's not used to that. That's not his normal way of looking at the world. Yeah. He can normally ignore things that he doesn't want to know or think about.
He's thoughtful when it comes to trying to solve a problem. How do I get out of here? How do I get something I want? He can reason his way to a conclusion quickly and in maybe an unconventional way, and that conclusion will kind of pop out of him. But reflecting on the past, that's something he's very uncomfortable with. And not only because even pre-Dagger, he seemed like a fairly hedonistic person anyway, who's just kind of trying to fill the void and kind of feed his feelings in the moment. But post-Dagger, he doesn't want to dwell on the past. It makes him super uncomfortable because he had so many holes in his memories and he didn't want to think about that. I mean, it's disturbing to think, wow, I can barely remember my sister's faces and those types of things. And then once he gets those holes filled, that's even creepier. He's like, I remember literally dying over and over and over. Yeah, brooding Matt is not where he likes to be. But I named another chapter that this is kind of parallel with, but there's some others this reminds me of too that I forgot to mention, where we actually start with him deep in thought. The chapter is constructed in this almost inside out way where we're just kind of dropped into Matt's body, and then little by little we get these clues about where he is and what the context is and what's happening. So one of these is in The Shadow Rising, and I don't remember really where it was placed in that book, but it's in Rodion, and he's playing knife throwing games with the Aiel. But I remember we talked about back then how cool the construction was, where he's just initially you're just dropped into his body and he's balancing on the edge of a fountain walking around. You're like, what's going on here? Where is there a fountain? I thought we'd been in the Aiel Waste. And then we get these clues little by little. And he wasn't particularly broody then, but he still was like, what in the light has my life become? I'm here with these bloody Aiel, And then it gets a little darker and a little deeper into his thoughts in The Fires of Heaven. Another monumental Matt chapter we get to is post-Couladin duel, the duel we never even see. So we get dropped into Matt's body when he's feeling all of his injuries and thinking about, there's no place to even stretch out and get comfortable. People are dancing around the fire, and then he recounts parts of Couladin's duel, and Couladin's ugly face is there talking back at him. And I love the construction of all of those chapters, where I think Jordan is really showing off some of his best work, where it's built inside out. The key action is in the middle in some kind of flashback, but we're just started with being dropped without context into Matt's body. But in addition to that structure, he's like sort of brooding in the beginning of all of those as well.
And the first one you mentioned, where he's at the fountain in Rodion, that's where he met Melindra.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And then he gets broodier after he has to kill her. He has these dark moments.
Yep.
It was self-defense. There was nothing he could do, yet at the same time, after he threw the knife, he would have recalled it if he could have, once he realized what he had just done.
He sort of tried to grab at the air to get it back.
Yes, yes. And that hurt me for Matt, just as this hurts me, because in this chapter you just read, he's not just in a position where where this is in front of him all the time. He had to walk down to the water's edge or the hill overlooking the water, whatever it was, and put himself in a position to count the ships, to see the sunken ships, to see the bodies being dragged up, and to see over into the graveyards, where there's just mass graves and people weeping. He put himself in a position where he had to see those things.
Yeah.
So he's very broody right now. He's had moments before, and they've lasted, but it's almost as if he keeps getting darker and darker as he goes along, because he has to do more and more, just as all of our characters do, our main characters do. Mm-hmm. They have to do more and more that at times compromise who they want to be.
Yeah, the pattern is asking a lot of them.
Right. It may not compromise who they are, but it compromises who they wish they could be.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, it's very melancholy. It's sad, and yet you love to see the action of Matt and the group leaving Ibudar, leaving the palace.
Yeah, for sure. One way I would sum up this chapter to kind of put a bow on my points about it, and I think it dovetails nicely with yours, is that it's beautiful in construction, but horrifying in content.
Oh, perfectly said. Yes, I agree.
And those were really all the notes I had on it.
Oh,
sorry.
My exact
you were
words.
saying the same thing.
So, well, and I think that's good. We've pretty much covered that one fairly well. So, if you'd like, I'll go on with chapter 2 now from
go for it.
Crossroads of Twilight, entitled Two Captains. Matt and Egianan walk back into Valen Luca's traveling show arm in arm, and are quietly warned by Petra and Clarine that there are Seanchan here in the show, but they didn't seem too interested in searching the place. Egianan slipped her arm around Matt and explained that she had no friends here on this side of the ocean, and that she would go unrecognized. Nobody would know her. And she also promised that she would act, this is quote, like a demure Ibudari woman, end quote. Many of the show folk had gathered around Valen Luca's wagon, eager to know what was happening. The Seanchan soldiers came out, and once they had passed by, Egianan whispered to Matt that she had known the young officer. Matt's luck had barely saved them from being recognized, it seemed. Then, talking to Luca, they found out that the Seanchan were after horses once again. Luca had shown him his exemption warrant, but he still sputtered and carried on that Matt was trying to ruin his show and get him killed. Luca wanted to leave Ibudar. He wanted to leave Ibudar like yesterday. Matt let him know that, hey, they could leave right now as soon as Tom Maryland returns, which earned Matt some harsh words from Egianan. She had commanded that no one was to leave without her permission. Oops. So Matt, Egianan, and Beldomen stalked to their wagon as the show began packing up in preparation to leave. None of them were in a good mood, but Egianan had to try explaining to Matt that a ship cannot have two captains. And, this is a quote, "This situation needs judgment and experience. We're in dangerous waters, and you have no knowledge of command," end quote. Matt returned with more than you might think, but then he just hurried on ahead and left them to meet up with Julian, Oliver, and the group to let them know. Noel arrived at the tent just when Matt did. Now, where had he been off to? Well, everybody seemed happy at the news that they were leaving, except for Oliver. He was just happy that he might get to ride his horse again, Wind. Well, and except for Matt as well, because the sound of dice rattling had just started up in his head once again.
I like this chapter a lot. It lightens up quite a bit from our really heavy one that we just covered, because we got some really, the comedy gold irony that we get from Matt anyways. There's so much of it in this chapter. Matt thinks of Egianan as so stubborn, and he's got no trace of self-awareness of his own stubbornness, of course. And she definitely outranks him by her society standards, so of course she's going to walk in and assume command. She has no reason to believe that he has really any competence other than he did just pull off this cool escape. I mean, that he does have that going for him, but you can imagine, like, why should I trust this guy? Of course she's going to walk in and be the captain. He's thinking kind of the same way, like he works for the Dragon Reborn and literally the pattern itself, so he's become pretty accustomed to people following him unquestioningly too. So they're both just kind of have this, it's hard to say privilege because they've both been through some pretty hard times lately, but they both do have this just assumption that they're going to be in charge wherever they go, and it's pretty funny when it's starting to come into conflict here.
Yes, and Matt even gets to the gist of it in his mind when they're there talking to Valen Luca. And, Egianan is, going on about, I commanded nobody was to leave. And Matt kind of thought to himself, I don't have the exact quote in front of me, something like, but Valen Luca, the only command he knows is gold, and I'm the one with the purse.
Yeah, that's true.
And again, I paraphrased that and probably butchered it terribly, but it does get the point across. In my mind, when we go through the reread, the more time we spend with Valen Luca, in my mind, the less he looks like I've always pictured him, and the more that he is Mr. Krabs from SpongeBob SquarePants.
Uh-huh.
Because the
just
more
kind of
we're
the
around
caricature of a
Yes.
capitalist crony type.
that was the
guy.
word I was going to use,
Yeah.
the caricature. He starts out as just a showman, but he gets more flamboyant, crazier, more penny pinching, and he becomes just, more money hungry as we go. So he becomes a caricature, of who his character used to be when the girls were around him earlier on in the series.
Like a political cartoon with a top hat from the 1920s or something, or the teens. Yeah.
Yes. Very much so. I just find that hilarious. I've started even picturing his voice in my mind to be to be Mr. Krabs.
On the next reread of the circus chapters with the girls, I think that'll make it a lot more entertaining. I don't hate that part, but it's still not really my favorite. And I know we got a little bit of kind of slow chapters with the circus coming up, so
yes,
I like that.
Yeah, but it is strange to me that Egianen would continue to try the whole "I'm the captain" thing when, as you said, it was Matt's idea that got them out of Ibu Dar.
Yeah.
Well, even as I say that, I think to myself, perhaps it seemed like that plan was flying by the seat of their pants to such a degree that it seemed totally chaotic, or it seemed totally chaotic, I should say. But I don't know, at the same time, he is the one with the gold. He's the one who financed everything. He's the one who came up with the plan, who worked the plan, and he and she both adapted it a little bit because being in command, they felt like they had the right to do that.
Yeah.
But she's very right. A ship cannot have two captains, especially in dangerous waters. That can't work. You have to establish a chain of command in any group, any society. I've known of friendships that were destroyed when people went into business together.
Yeah.
Because there came to a point where they had everything split 50-50, and they were working together, and they were such good friends until they had a difference of opinion. And you can't have two leaders. You can't have two bosses. You can't have two captains. And everything gets torn apart. And so I've seen that many times in the business world. We've seen, different situations like that. So it's best in group settings, relationship settings where, where you're sticking together, you have a common goal. You've got to put one person in charge. You can't even really rule by committee and do it very effectively. You've got to put one person in charge.
It's slower, at least. It's certainly slower to do it by committee.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, and I say this working for, I work in a profession that likes to think of itself as less hierarchical than many of those, and we do everything by committee. There's not a hiring manager. There is a search committee for every time we hire somebody, and there are certainly problems with that approach. There still has to be a chair of the committee the way we do it, so we're not complete like anarcho-syndicalists or anything or whatever it is. But yes, I hear what you're saying about the two captains problem. I love Matt's smart aleck response to it too.
Yes.
So your quote about, well, I got more experience than you might think is really funny, but back that up just like one more interaction, and he goes, "We're not on a ship."
Right. Yes. Yes. Oh,
that's one of my favorite quotes from him. You can't have two captains on a ship. We're not on a ship. He knows exactly what she's saying. He's just playing dumb just to push her buttons.
Right. Right. Oh, wow, that sounds familiar. Someone who tries to be difficult just to rattle people. That is, I'm not as good at it as Matt Cawthon, but I have a tendency to do that just to mess with people, to sit back and laugh at them for it. Yeah. Pretend like I don't have a clue what they're talking about.
Well, speaking of pushing buttons, we have talked about how Matt does that. We brought this up several episodes ago about, well, he seems like he brings the worst out in a lot of people. Is this just part of his nature? Is it the Taviran thing? What's going on? But he thinks something similar about Egianen. I mean, the big difference between them on this regard, though, is she just doesn't do it with a sense of humor. But he was thinking he's worried about their whole cover because she could easily be recognized because she upsets so many people.
Yes.
She just peeves everybody off that she knows, and he's like, well, of course we're going to bump into somebody she's upset before, because she's upset thousands of people. She could irritate a brick, and he could. We know this of Matt. He could irritate a brick, but that's what he says of her. So it's another one of those great dramatic, ironic moments that he's totally unself-aware about, and it's just a hilarious case of two characters butting heads because they're too much alike, at least on a couple of dimensions here.
Right.
And there's Luca too. You know how he clashes with Luca on some dimensions. Now Matt is not quite as flamboyant, I guess you could say, but he's getting there though. He started to like the outfits Tylan gave him, and when he has the opportunity to wear lace again, he's gonna, I'm sure.
Oh yes, but he does.
Here's what he thinks about Luca. Quote, "Some people could just not see beyond their own noses." End quote. So if I had encountered that quote unattributed, I actually probably would have laid it at Nynaeve's door, because she's so good at having the three fingers pointing back at her when she points at somebody. Right, but it captures Matt's ironic situation perfectly with his fellow travelers.
Yes,
It applies well to how he's behaving towards Luca, how he's behaving towards Agianan, etc. So it's just a great comedic chapter all around.
And one thing that caught my attention too, that I believe I missed on my first few times through this story, is when he announced, as soon as Tom Merrill gets back, we can leave, and he's speaking to Valen and Luca, and Valen and Luca actually dances a little jig. He's so happy. And it reminds me of what you said in a recent episode about some of the characters, their reactions, some of the Aes Sedai specifically, their reactions being so over the top with the fainting and different things that it's almost like watching an anime where they exaggerate the emotional reactions of most everybody just for that comedic effect. And that's what I pictured this as.
It's hard to see it just seriously as if it were live action or real life. I hear you. This is absolutely one of those moments.
Right. Now, if there are similar moments to that in the show, then whoever plays Valen and Luca will have to be so over-the-top flamboyant that seems like a natural reaction, or they'll just have to cut those little moments out, which I doubt we'll have this exact scene, this exact things going on in the show, because there will be many things that'll have to be consolidated around this point of the story. But if some point in there, if they have him that extravagant, that they would have had to have built up to that, or it will just look so corny that no one could ever accept it.
Yeah, it's so hard to imagine how that might be pulled off, to be honest with you. But that's me not always being drawn. I'm not drawn to very many campy things if it's live action. I've never really been into musicals and stuff like that. And many of our listeners may be super into that kind of stuff. So that might be your jam if Luca does a jig legitimately live action. I'm having a hard time picturing it in a way that wouldn't make me roll my eyes right now.
But then again, some people can act so well, and as I said, can bring out elements of a character that they can make that seem normal, but they have to be that extravagant, that over the top all the time. Or at least majority of the time, so you would expect something that silly out of them. And it is true, oftentimes when he bows, even if he's not wearing a cape, he's moving as if he's flourishing a cape. I think I can't remember if it's this part or another part where Matt says, he flourishes so much you can imagine
see the embroidery on the cape.
You can see the embroidery. Yes, he takes it up a notch. Yes, exactly. Oh, I loved that. That was so funny. And of course, Matt does that sometimes too. Will flourish a non-existent cloak. So another parallel there of how he does not see the similarities between himself and other people. So, well, that's all I've got for this one. How about yourself?
I've got a couple more notes. They're kind of small, but they are not funny. So most of what was in this chapter was just comedy to me. There's there's just a couple of other nuggets in here I want to discuss briefly. It's Matt, we learn in this chapter that he put the Aes Sedai together in the wagon with the Suldam, which is at first I'm like, wow, that's cruel. What the Aes Sedai, especially Teslin and Edicina, must be going through to be around them. They don't really have ways to process their trauma away from, potential abusers who believe that they're subhuman. But then the Suldam, have to be, even if they're trying to take a firm hand with these Damani, they're former Suldam who were revealed to themselves, not really to anyone else, that they also have the capacity to channel. So they probably have to have this terrible conflict to be even around Damani again.
Yes.
So it's cruel all around. I would say definitely worse for the Damani, but just like, Matt, could you really do that? That's awful. But when I think about it pragmatically, I can't really come up with a better solution either, because I think both of these groups of women would just act way too weird around anybody else if they had to be roommates with any of the other people in the show. I mean, they're both both groups would be so jumpy and nervous and looking around hoping somebody wouldn't find them, and it would be hard to say like why they're in the show, what's their skill.
Yes.
You know.
And if I'm not mistaken, he in a later chapter talks to himself, at least he talks about how he did this so one group would watch the other, and the Aes Sedai would be watching the Sul'dam would be watching the Aes Sedai, both of them afraid to let the other out of their sight, for fear of what they would do. Mutually assured destruction kind of thing. Yes, exactly. So he did some of that intentionally.
Yeah.
Chances are he didn't really understand the level of trauma. I mean, he knew it was there because he had talked to Teslin in the kennels. He knew how close she was to breaking. So, yeah, he understood that it was there, but I don't think he understood how that trauma was extended by putting them together.
Right?
Or he didn't care and thought they all deserved it. I don't really know.
I think I'm imagining he probably didn't want to have to stop and try and empathize with any of them, because he's like, this is what we have to do. There's not really any other meaningful alternatives. I might as well just kind of flip the switch and just get it started. And
yes.
I'm having a hard time wording that, but just kind of like set them on that track and let them go.
Yeah.
Because he can't really afford to think about it, to be honest with you. Because I don't know how else you would hide these women other than that mutually assured destruction scenario. And them also, they would just be way too weird around anybody else, way too suspicious. And similarly, I like that at least Matt is getting some punishment in a similar way, in that. And I totally must have missed this on my first read through. I had to read this chapter twice before I even noticed it this time around. He is he's rooming with Egyonin and Doman, which has got to be so awful and awkward, because he's got to make it look like he's dating Egyonin, but wow, that's got to be uncomfortable to be the third wheel there. So,
but he doesn't act like he's uncomfortable. He acts like that Doman should feel uncomfortable. So he's just typical Matt. He's our boy there.
Yeah. The only other note I had about this chapter to really close it out was right at the end anyway, when Matt wonders where Noel was. He should have gotten there way before Matt himself did, because he wandered off back towards the wagons, and he brushes it off right away. And I was curious what you thought about this, what Noel might have been doing.
I really don't know. We know that Noel has some ties with the Dark Friends, and there's some problems there, but I don't recall it ever bringing it out, and I've already gotten well ahead of this in my personal reread, and there's nothing that reflects back on it that I can recall, or if there is, it's so subtle that I just haven't caught it. So I really don't know. I've had a few suspicions, and as I said, some of them, it made me think of his ties with the Dark Friends, but we don't see any fruit come of that I can think of.
Right.
So perhaps it was just finding something to do with his fish.
Yeah, could have been.
It might have been, but it looks very suspicious. It's one of these things where they're planting the suspicions in our minds, so we start brooding over it, and then unless there's, I know we've probably got listeners that are screaming at their portable device right now because they know the answer to this and I don't. But it's almost as if he just builds this up and then drops it. It makes me wonder, how many times do I see something that looks suspicious to me in my life, and it's something totally, completely innocuous that someone's doing. But that's what this appears to be, that we don't know of anything going on. It appears to be innocuous, yet at the same time, it looks so weird, so creepy.
It does look
He's
sketchy.
Up to something. Yes.
I think that. So I was thinking that it might have had something to do with that he might be under some compulsion. He might have had a meeting with a contact in town somewhere. Now that it's been several days since they escaped, he might have had time for another one of them to kind of seek him out. Because I think they can sort of sense each other to some extent, like strong dark friends or something. Yeah. I may be off about that, but he might have just had some contacts who knew where he was going. Because he kind of knew about Matt's plan for a while, and who knows who he might have told before he said, well, I might as well come with you, Matt.
Right.
So But we don't have a lot of solid evidence. This is all just really speculation because it's all very subtle. It's very under the surface. And we know he's done some dark stuff in his life, but he does try to redeem himself there at the end.
Yes.
So, I was going to ask you, since you are, further along in your reread, so it's interesting that there's nothing a little more overt than that. I thought I must have just missed it. So, yeah, good to know. I'm suspicious of this, but it like you said, it doesn't end up bearing any fruit. And I think Noel is one of those people who ended up being sort of strong enough, sort of like Morghese, where he was able to break whatever compulsion he might have had. So I think he's got temptations and people pulling at him to leave, but I don't think he's actively betraying them right now.
If he did give information or whatever, it had to be really someone within the show. He didn't have time to go any further than that.
You're right. Yeah.
I mean, they were inside the show already when they heard about the Shanshan, I think, or right there at the gate. And Noel, from what I understand, went on in because Matt told him, you go get everybody ready.
Yeah.
Or tell them, to kind of warn them about the Shanshan. And then, Matt goes talk to Valen and then goes to the tent and goes pretty quickly because he's trying to get away from Egyanan and Beldomen, who of course don't take the hint and follow him into the tent with Julian and Amathera and Oliver, and and then Noel gets there about the same time he does. So Noel, he took a detour. He could have talked to somebody, but it would have had to have been someone there within the show. So we don't really know. He might have just been feeding information to some of the Aes Sedai at that point because they weren't there. They were in a separate tent.
That's right.
Or separate wagons. So, I mean, we don't know who it is.
Yeah.
Or, maybe even somebody among the Red Arms. But it was someone who was there with the show. He didn't have time for anything further than that.
Well, part of what I meant was before they even got to the wagons, before their escape, he might have been letting contacts know where he anticipated to be. So, because he did, he would leave the palace all day. Nobody knows where he goes. He comes back to tell stories and sleep. He did tell Matt, like, I was going to leave around the same time as you anyway. When he shows up to grab Tuon, I believe it is, when he's like, well, I was about to leave anyway, because it's probably not good to be associated with you right about now.
Right.
So, and it's just weird how he pops up at all the right times. He popped up there with the Golem. He pops up there with Tuon, and nobody knows what he's doing all the time. So there's certainly potential there. And I think one of his contacts could have pulled him aside for a second, or maybe he was getting the calls of some dark friend, kind of compulsion going on, but didn't have time to act it out. I don't know. I'm keeping my eye on him.
Right. Yeah, definitely. And then again, like I said, he may have some elderly lady friend there in the camp that likes fish. Or so. I mean,
there you go.
It would be so innocuous. I just don't know.
Yep, absolutely.
And if it ever comes out, it's further ahead than what I am in my reread currently. So
he could have just stopped to take a leak first, I guess. Now that I'm thinking about it, it really could be very innocuous.
that is something we don't get a lot of description of in this story.
Oh, no, they never talk about that stuff in this series. Right. So, it's got to happen off screen somewhere.
Oh, yes. Very well could have been. Or may have taken.
We're making longer. Lan blush right now.
Yes.
Because you remember Lan, there's just some things you don't talk about.
The things you talk about are things you do not. Yes. Oh, man. Well, I believe that's all I've got. So I hope that all of you will join us next week for episode 27, where we study Matt Cawthon's perspective in chapters 3 and 28 from Crossroads of Twilight, which, by the way, has nothing to do with sparkling vampires.
Subscribe to Wheel of Mine on Podbean, Stitcher, Google Play, Apple, Spotify, or YouTube under the name Lajara Dane, that's LaJaradayne, to get notified when a new episode drops every Wednesday. Keep in mind that Google Play Podcast, though, is being phased out soon, so I will update you as I replace that platform, or maybe not. Maybe it'll just be Podbean, Stitcher, Apple, Spotify. Who knows? I will let you know when I figure out what to do with that. Leave us some feedback by rating and reviewing on whichever platform you listen to us on, or contact us through email at lajaradane@gmail.com, or on Twitter @mind_wheel, or contact me at Lajara Sedai, Sedai, on Twitter. This is not the ending to the turning of the wheel of mind, but it is an ending.
When Matt and Egyanan arrived, the Seanchan's shoulders... I'm sorry.
That is such a hard phrase. That is such a hard phrase to say. I practice it when I'm alone. Yes. I kid you not, because I've heard you mess it up enough times, and it's almost like it embedded it in my brain even more.
So, let me begin this entire paragraph again.